Both Labour and the Tories are fighting against the surging popularity of Reform, who are polling level with Labour and even, according to some polls, edging ahead of them. Rachel, you've written a feature this week for the magazine asking whether Reform can be taken seriously. Nigel Farage's party has had its fair share of controversy recently, from the Rupert Lowe saga to a selection process that's failed to vet some candidates with questionable and sometimes downright outrageous views. But parking all that, should we be considering them as a party that, according to some estimates, could win a general election?
Well, there was this explosive poll by More in Common over the Easter weekend that suggested that were a general election held now, Reform would win the most number of seats, which is not quite the same as winning an election, because the suggestion was that they'd be on 180 seats and Labour and the Conservatives would be on 165 each, and you can't really form a majority with that makeup. Now, the obvious thing to say about that is we're 4 years out from an election. It was an MRP poll, so people get very excited about this because it's a way of polling seat by seat that has proved more successful in past elections. But really, there are just too many unknowns. The economy could collapse between now and then. The economy could get better. We could go to war. A lot of things could happen. What I think it does show is that the electorate is fracturing. And when you have a two-party voting system, which is what we have, and you have three parties all at around 20-25%, which is what we've got, you can end up with some really strange results. So I think the Reform strategy at the moment is to maintain this idea that they're now one of the players, that they are able to convert their polling figures, and we've seen polls that put them ahead of the Conservatives, ahead of Labour even. They can convert that in an actual election. What does that mean for the local elections? Some of the people I spoke to said that it's not necessarily about winning, say, 20% of councillors available. It's about winning that amount of vote share. So showing that the vote share on paper equates to vote share in real life, even if it doesn't give you actual councillors. It's also about showing that they have a presence in parts of the country that you wouldn't necessarily think that they would, or in parts of the country that have traditionally been thought of as Labour areas.
What kind of areas are we talking about there?
So Doncaster and Durham are two that they're really keen on. Doncaster, obviously, Ed Miliband's neck of the woods. It's difficult for this round of local elections because most of the seats are Conservative seats, so there are just more Conservative seats available. They're also looking very closely, as we spoke about with Ben Walker a couple of weeks ago, at the Runcorn-Helsby by-election. And again, the aim is not necessarily to win, although I'm sure they would love to win, but it's to show that they're a serious contender. And if Labour win that by-election, I was told, the narrative will be, well, if you vote Tory, you get Labour. This idea that there is the quote-unquote uniparty, Labour and Tory, and that Reform are the only viable alternative.
I mean, George Rachel's right, isn't it? They're Reform are really trying to present themselves as the de facto opposition.
Increasingly so. I mean, one of the things that's most important in opposition politics is a sense of momentum. And Labour is an unpopular government, but voters are still disillusioned with the Conservatives. They've done very little remarkably little in some ways, since the election to rebuild. And it's Farage who is insurgent. And if they win the Runcorn by-election, then those 89 Labour MPs with Reform in second place will be looking nervously over their shoulder, and they already were on the night of the general election. I remember one New Labour MP saying to me then, the populist right will be the challenge of this parliament, noting that Pat McFadden and Bridget Phillipson had Reform in second place in their seats. And in fact, that poll Rachel refers to, 9 cabinet ministers would lose their seats to Reform. So they're a challenge to Labour on a basic electoral level. But there's also a deeper challenge, which is they are claiming to be the party of working people. And Farage is going into more leftish populist territory on public ownership, saying he wants a partnership with the unions. And that's really a challenge to Labour's core purpose, the reason the party was founded. So in both polling terms and in sort of moral political terms, they are more of a threat to Labour than the Tories. OK, so Reform's popularity is causing a massive headache for both Labour and the Conservatives. Let's stick with Labour then for the time being. And we know that
of the 15 council seats that Reform have won since the general election, 7, so pretty much half, have been from Labour, which might surprise some people. And George, you spoke to the Environment Secretary this week, Steve Reed, and he said to you, and this is a quote, he says, Reform have been doing better as people's trust in politics has been broken. They are a symptom of that. This government has to rebuild that broken trust, and until there are visible proof points of change, I don't think people will be prepared to give that trust back. He's right, isn't he, Steve Reed? I mean, do the public really start at some point relatively soon need to be seeing some benefit of this Labour government?
Absolutely. And I mean, the government would point to some improvements, NHS waiting lists falling, real wages are rising. But I think the big question for the next election is, will things improve fast enough for Labour to be re-elected? Because Britain is not in a good state. Living standards have stagnated for almost 2 decades. Life expectancy, one study said this week, was sort of Soviet-like. If in decline. We have some of the worst access to healthcare in the world. Rail fares and energy bills are some of the highest in the West. Can they change all of that enough for people to give them a second term, in this volatile era? Because if they don't, that's the discontent that Nigel Farage is going to harness probably more effectively than the Conservatives can, unless they make big changes soon.
Well, Rachel, let's talk about the Tories then. There's a fundamental disagreement playing out at the heart of the party, isn't there, about how to deal with reform? Just talk us through what's going on.
So the two main arguments are, do you put all your effort into uniting the right? And that could look a number of different ways. It could look like a pact to not stand candidates in the same seats. It could look like a formal merger of some kind, presumably under a different leader to the current Conservative.
Reports that Robert Jenrick is scheming away to...
Robert Jenrick on manoeuvres. I think his exact words earlier this week were one way or another, which I think leaves the door open to all kinds of suggestions. Esther McVey was the one who suggested in leaked comments that you'd have some kind of agreement not to stand candidates in the same seats. The other one, the other strategy is not taking them seriously, essentially, and continuing to present them as so far on the extreme, disorganised, chaotic, don't have a plan, don't need to touch them. We are the party of the right. We are the Conservatives. We have a track record of delivering, and we're not going to get distracted by what Nigel Farage is out there doing. And you hear different perspectives on how successful that one has been, because that is kind of what the Conservatives have tried to do since the threat of UKIP. And they've had kind of mixed results on it. And I think the momentum is probably towards, no, we need to do something to unite the right, because the last election showed that when the right is fractured, the Conservatives really suffer. I mean, it's also the case that if the Conservatives are no longer seen as the de facto sensible party of the right, then they're also going to suffer. And I've spoken to Conservatives who are really worried about what happens to the Conservative brand, as it were, if Reform do overtake them in terms of seats, because then increasingly, well, what's the point of voting Conservative at all? You get lots of Tories who are really uncomfortable about any kind of deal, not least because Nigel Farage has made it his mission to destroy the Conservative Party. He's taken his inspiration from Canada, from the Reform Party there. That's kind of why he changed the Brexit Party's name to Reform. But you also get, and I found this really interesting, you also get scepticism about a deal in Reform circles.
I was going to ask you, any pact obviously depends on both sides agreeing. So where are Reform at?
Well, Reform currently, the line coming out of them is absolutely no way. The Conservatives are desperate. They're only saying it because they're desperate. We don't need them. Now, obviously, Nigel Farage is known for his political expediency. I spoke to people who thought he would actually be a bit more opportunistic were the offer to arise. But I think it's really important that for a lot of Reform supporters, they don't see Reform as a more radical right-wing Conservative Party. They see the Conservative Party as broken and Reform as being the alternative. And once you start suggesting that you might make a deal, this idea that you are not part of the establishment, that you are the fresh start that is needed because the political system as it currently stands isn't working, you kind of lose that appeal.
Well, and you also ignore the fact that that Reform are attracting former Labour voters as well, who wouldn't see themselves on sort of the radical right. I mean, George, do we think next week's local elections, is that an opportunity for there to be a real tipping point when Reform sort of stop being seen as that party appealing to the more extreme edges of the right in this country, and then they step into mainstream politics?
It's a massive opportunity. If they win Runcorn, if they win Doncaster, if they win, say, County Durham Council, they will present themselves as the insurgent force. They will say, you know, we haven't just parked our tanks on Labour's lawn, but we're demolishing their houses now to their electoral fortresses, and that will create a huge amount of debate in Labour circles. Yes, they've got time, but it will intensify the existing debate about the right political space for the government. Is it that more blue Labour territory? You'll have others on the sort of progressive wing saying, well, we're losing votes to the Lib Dems and Greens. You've got to take care of your left flank. So there'll be a big internal debate within Labour. But it will also bring challenges for Reform, because with greater success comes increased scrutiny.
You have to go as well.
Yeah. So Nigel Farage, the Labour strategist, think he'll have a challenge where he is going to win a lot of former Tory councils, former Tory seats. Reform's membership and Reform's most sort of loyal supporters are more Thatcherite than the Tories. They're very much on the right. But he's also trying to appeal to more left-leaning voters in the north. So how does he keep his own coalition together and cope with the basic scrutiny of candidates, policy platform, foreign policy? We know he's got a problem with his association with Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. But it's a massive opportunity for Reform. Labour will try and dismiss it as midterm blues. But of course, we're not even midterm. You know, it's less than a year since their landslide victory. And that just shows, you know, really how tough things are for Starmer.
One thing I would keep an eye on between the local elections and the next general elections is, does there emerge an anti-reform movement? And I think that's something that's not really being priced into the current polls, to the MRP poll. What we saw in 2024 was a huge amount of anti-Tory sentiment of voters having had enough with the Tories and just voting for whoever in their seat was most likely to get the Tories out. It is possible that if Reform look like a serious contender for government, you see something like that emerging on the left and on the centre. Now, it's quite difficult to imagine that now, not least because all of the anger is at the Labour government. But I spoke to someone close to the leadership in Reform who said that the aim is to make the next general election all about dissatisfaction with the Labour government. You tried the Conservatives, they were a disaster. We tried Labour, they're a disaster. Now vote Reform. That's what they want the message to be. If the next election becomes about reform, like we've seen with right-wing parties in European elections, then they said all bets are off, the narrative changes, and it could become an election that's all about stopping reform, which is obviously a very different dynamic.
Which is what we saw in France, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, or in some ways in Canada. I mean, the real optimist in Labour would say you've got the NDP there, the New Democratic Party, so that's the centre-left party, and their support has collapsed because people are going to Mark Carney's Liberals to vote against Trump, essentially, and defend the national interest. So there's some in Labour who hope they could summon that French-style or Canadian-style sort of progressive front, but it's a big bet. And, you know, what focus groups are showing is that they're voters who weren't instinctively sympathetic to Farage, but who look at the state of Britain, who look at how Labour's already been challenged in government, go, look, we might just roll the dice on Farage. I think it's that group that Labour really need to worry about.
Just finally, Rachel, because you've been talking to people within Reform and you've written this great feature in the magazine this week, how much import is Reform placing on next week's local elections?
A lot. Like they know that it's really crucial for their momentum, as George said. I actually spoke to somebody who's a strategist who said that because people in Reform are relatively new to politics, they haven't learnt the art of expectation management yet, and that's an issue for them because all parties try and do expectation management before the elections. And actually, some are a bit worried that all the focus on Runcorn and Helsby, which looks on paper like a really safe Labour seat. So if Reform do win it, that's a huge story. But if Reform don't win it, because they've done so much talking about how they could have a chance of winning it, that will look like a setback, even though it shouldn't necessarily be one that's in contention in the first place. So I think they are learning how to do election expectation management, and they could probably take some lessons, strangely, from Kemi Badenoch, who's basically come out and gone, yeah, it's going to be a disaster for us.